The cell smells of vinegar, warm water, and dried fennel roots. Bundles of hyssop and chamomile lie on the table, next to a mortar, bowls, and clean linen bandages. An adult woman with chills after a long journey has been brought to the infirmary, followed by a nun with a headache and weakness from night vigils. Here, prayers coexist with care. Boiling water makes as much noise as psalms, and neat notes on parchment are as important as order in the service. Dear viewers, welcome. Write to us about which city and country you are watching from, and whether you have encountered stories where concern for health was hampered by fear of talking about the body. Leave your comments. Your experience is important. Make yourself comfortable and enjoy listening. We will examine how Abbess Hildegard of Bingen wrote about female juices and herbs, trying to maintain a fine line between doctrine and practice, and how her texts survived the controversy to become a guide to care. In the 12th century, monastic life was based on obedience, labor, and silence. But adult patients regularly flocked to the gates along the banks of the Rhine. Lay women after exhausting fasts, women with fevers from stale water, widows with ulcers on their legs, craftswomen with burns, singers with sore throats. City hospitals demanded payment and herbal ingredients. The monastery accepted patients, relying on alms and the harvest from the garden. From this, a routine was born. Boil water, air out the cells, wash with vinegar, warm gently, feed moderately, and allow sleep. Hildegard recorded this in language understandable to her era. Heat and cold, moisture and dryness, movement of juices, the power of herbs. Alongside this were dosages, duration, and signs of improvement. This was not a challenge to morals, it was the engineering of care. The first myth, that the Church forbade everything, is shattered by manuscripts listing fennel for spasms, hyssop for shortness of breath, sage for weakness, vinegar rinses for ulcers, and the cessation of excessive bloodletting in emaciated adult women in winter. The main risk came not from the text, but from the customs of the city, refreshing the blood with incisions, maintaining the feat of fasting in cold and poverty, and applying coarse wool to wounds. The monastery responded with numbers and written words. After so many days of compresses, the smell and pain disappear. After stopping bloodletting, color returns to the face. With daytime sleep, tremors and dizziness decrease. Paper became a shield. But the more precise the language, the easier it was to turn it into an accusation. Lists of wetness at the bottom and loosening of constriction with warmth in adult women were rewritten out of context and presented as boldness. In response, the infirmary reduced metaphors to a minimum and linked each formula to a procedure: the volume of the jug, the number of washes, the temperature by hand, the duration of rest for so many psalms, the criteria for canceling bloodletting, a gray face, a rare pulse, cold hands. Visitors, accustomed to catching words, were confronted with schedules and records. It is more difficult to argue with boiling water and clean cloth than with an image. At the same time, a network of small practices grew. Corridors of warmth and silence were introduced. Hours when boiling water had to be delivered to the cell without delay, and after washing, a short rest and food were guaranteed. In the records, it looked meager, but it reduced tremors and the number of fainting spells. The herb garden was tied to the calendar. Hyssop and sage were dried faster, and mint was used for infusions for breathing. Woolen rags were banned from the cells for treating ulcers. Only clean cloth was allowed. In the kitchen, the diet for the emaciated was changed. Warm soups, small portions of boiled water, moderate wine to warm the blood without overheating. Caution became a system. Meanwhile, the political climate was changing. Disputes with the clergy were intensifying in the emperor's lands, and any letter containing carnal words could become a cause for concern. Some of the brothers suggested keeping quiet, Hildegard chose discipline in wording. Anything that could not be said without temptation was replaced by climate, work, food, and rest. But the dosages, duration, and signs of improvement remained. Thus, a compromise was born. The language was dry, the procedures detailed. The first turning point was a visitation demanding less detail. They tried to remove seasonality and labor from the sections on adult women. The monastery showed stamps in the margins, a sign that the line had been verified by results and could not be replaced. And tables, where seasonality was left, there were fewer fainting spells. Where references to labor were retained, there were fewer pains after laundry. The second twist was an increase in deaths from cleansing practices in the city. The monastery responded with memos without dangerous words, signs of exhaustion, the sequence of salvation. The third shift was economic. Donations were converted into goods, firewood, fabric, vinegar, tied to outcomes, and dependence on rhetoric weakened. This is how these years begin. The cells keep boiling water and records. The garden keeps drying racks. The scriptorium keeps branded lines. Where myth waves shame, the document spreads canvases and records the result. And while another winter draws dampness into the walls, it is this boring precision that retains the right to speak about the bodies of adult women in the language of care, not fear. In neighboring abodes, copyists transcribed lists of herbs and care routines along with cautious terminology, but anxiety spread faster. If the text still mentions the movement of juices in adult women, does that mean the monastery has crossed the line of what is permissible? The chapters asked for restraint because the political climate was capricious. The power of the departments and secular patrons was measured by paperwork, and an extra line could easily become a cause for suspicion. This was immediately felt in the infirmary. Every edit of the text cost an hour at the wash basin. Every visit from an official meant delays in washing. In winter, the stoves barely warmed the stone. Dampness rose from the floor, and the entire household was reduced to accounting. Boiling water by the bucket, vinegar by the jug, fabric by the cut, afternoon naps by the psalm. In the records, where complaints, measures, and outcomes were noted in words, arguments against the myth that the church forbade everything accumulated. Adult patients came out of the heat after vinegar douches. The emaciated recovered when the excessive bloodletting stopped, and warmth, food, and rest were introduced, and ulcers closed under clean cloth instead of coarse wool. But language remained vulnerable. It was enough to take a line out of context, and the cautious formula about restraining the lower body turned into too bold in the marketplace. In order not to drown in rhetoric, a framework of safety, moderation, verifiability was constructed. Boiled water, ventilation, rejection of dirty bandages, and cleansing at signs of exhaustion. Moderate rations and fasting restrictions for adult women in winter. Recording results daily. How long it took for the tremors to stop, when color returned to the face. How many washes it took for the smell to disappear. During visits, they brought clippings with suspicious words, and the monastery laid out field care charts next to them. A jug of this volume, a cloth of this width, a temperature at hand, corridors of warmth and silence, signs of cancellation of bloodletting, a gray face, a rare pulse, cold fingers. Opponents caught images, but saw a schedule. It was no longer a metaphor that had to be argued with, but a procedure. Meanwhile, the urban economy of the purifying art had serious consequences. Women fainted after incisions due to hunger and cold, and blood refreshment brought tremors and emptiness. The monastery responded with unambiguous memos. Recognize exhaustion. Warm up. Give small amounts of warm water to drink. Stop the incisions. Allow sleep and soft food. These sheets, copied onto cheap parchment, moved through the shops and laundries faster than sermons, and reduce the number of serious cases simply by the power of a clear algorithm. Within the community, fear of letting go was replaced by experience. The data in words showed that after 3 days of compresses, the stench disappears. After 5 days, the edges of the ulcers close, and after 7 days, the ability to do light work returns. The arithmetic of outcomes overcame the habit of harsh gestures. To protect the text from conscientious drying out, the manuscripts were stamped with marks indicating that the line had been verified by practice and was not subject to replacement. Copyists were instructed to check against a model list where the procedure and an example of the outcome were written next to the phrase. At the same time, the herb garden and logistics were improved. Hyssop and sage were dried closer to the sunny side. Mint was used in respiratory infusions. Barrels of vinegar were taken into account for the hot season. Corridors of warmth were fixed in the schedule so that boiling water would not cool down on the way to the cell, and corridors of silence gave the body a short but protected rest. When a new commission demanded proper cuts to remove seasonality and labor from the sections on adult women, the monastery put a register on the table. Where seasonality and labor are taken into account, there are fewer fainting spells and dizziness after laundry. Where they were crossed out in the trial list, breakdowns return. Thus, the myth of too bold met the document of too measurable. The townspeople themselves, accustomed to counting jugs of wine and sacks of grain, converted alms into kind, firewood, cloth, vinegar, linking supplies to outcomes. How much was washed? How much was heated? How many people returned to work? In this accounting, care gained autonomy from rhetoric, and when leaflets about shame as medicine were once again being distributed in the square, a much more convincing text hung at the gates of the infirmary, lists of what had been done and what it had led to. Fewer fevers ending in death, fewer ulcers smelling of rot, fewer emaciated people fainting. Thus, the second line of the story was reinforced not by a slogan, but by a procedure. It is permissible to talk about the bodies of adult women only to the extent that each word is attached to a bucket, a sheet, and a line in the records, and this is the language that survives any visitation. In the infirmary, record-keeping was intensified, as if each bowl of boiling water were a line in the account of life. In the morning, they noted how many jugs were used for washing. In the afternoon, they recorded compresses and rest. In the evening, they wrote down the body's reaction, whether the tremors had gone away, whether the face had cleared up, whether the smell from the ulcers had subsided. Adult patients ceased to be a nameless crowd. Age, season, work, food, housing, everything became a factor in their care. At the same time, a two-hands rule was introduced for severe cases. One nurse kept the heat and water, while the other monitored breathing and pulse so that dangerous practices could be stopped in time. In the margins of the manuscript, next to the sections on adult women, there were stamps indicating a verified line and references to weather signs. How the skin changes in the north wind, how the cold tightens the stone, how the dampness of the cell provokes spasms. The language remained dry, but behind it lay a dense mechanism that was difficult to extract from the text without losing the results. Urban moralists changed their angle of attack. Instead of direct accusations of boldness, they promoted the formula of luxury care. They said that soft cloths, boiling water, vinegar, and daytime sleep undermine discipline. This myth attempted to devalue the simplest sanitary economy. The monastery responded with a mirror of numbers. Where there is clean cloth, ulcers rot less often. Where boiling water reaches the cell without delay, fevers fall faster. Where an emaciated adult woman is given a short nap during the cold season, there are fewer fainting spells and disruptions to the prayer schedule. To this, they added economic transparency, a summary of firewood, vinegar, fabric, and herbs linked to seasonal outbreaks of disease. Trustees, accustomed to counting bags of grain, saw the sense in this tedious paperwork and converted part of the alms into natural quotas, thereby removing care from the blackmail of correct words. The third twist was an external attempt to create a register of seductive places. Several clerics proposed mandatory preliminary editing of all descriptions of lower abdominal pain, cramps, and wetness, even when referring to adult women in a state of exhaustion. Cuttings devoid of context and a draft list of prohibited expressions were laid on the table. In response, the monastery laid out field maps. Next to each suspicious phrase was a diagram of the procedure, the measure, the sign of termination, the expected outcome, and an example from the register. Where a word replaced a detail, there was a risk of misunderstanding among the sisters. Where the procedure remained, the outcome remained predictable. This logic was formalized into a neutral standard for all medical records, without dividing people by gender. Goal, means, measure, cancellation threshold, daily recording. To reject the standard meant to admit that the argument was not about morality, but about the right not to report. The standard was adopted, and the register of seductive places lost its teeth. Meanwhile, the warm season arrived in the city, which did not heal but festered. Wandering fevers multiplied in cramped courtyards, and adult women with ulcers and a foul odor flocked to the infirmary. Short sections on hygiene for households appeared in the manuscripts. Boil water, keep dishes away from sewage ditches, change stagnant barrels, do not put wool on festering surfaces, ventilate, dry laundry in the wind, not in smoke. These sheets, rewritten in large handwriting, spread through the markets faster than sermons. In response to whispers about luxury, the monastery arranged a display of warm and quiet corridors for charitable brotherhoods, jugs of boiling water, benches for rest, and shifts on duty. After such a tour, even strict people found it harder to see the care as indulgence. Inside the cell, another invisible task was being solved: the wear and tear on those who cared for the sick. Their hands cracked from vinegar and water, their backs ached from constant bending, and their eyes grew dim in the semi-darkness. Hildegard established a recovery regime. After a hard week, each sister undergoes a short cycle of warming her hands, sleeping, and eating. Shifts at the tub do not last longer than the agreed time. After night hours, those who provide care have the right to a daytime nap. These points seemed unusual, but the register showed an indirect effect. With the caregivers' strength preserved, there were fewer mistakes in their actions, fewer disruptions in the corridors of warmth, and more stable outcomes. Thus, medical discipline expanded to include care for those who maintain the system. A new threat came from the scriptoria: voluntary notes. Copyists, fearing visits, crossed out subtle guidelines: how to determine temperature by hand, how long to hold a compress, when to stop warming. The monastery responded with double protection: an index of model lists, where each verified line was accompanied by an example from the register, and stamps in the margins prohibiting editing without the decision of the Council of Sisters and the bursar. Even strict clerics understood the stamps. It was not a sign of courage, but of responsibility for the outcome. In the original and copies, traces of handwriting, boiling water, and time became as important a mark as a signature. Leaflets about shame as medicine continued to be distributed in city squares. Their persistence was easily explained. Fear has no logistics costs. Care is costly: water, firewood, cloth, time. To conserve resources, the monastery built a network of exchanges with craft guilds: cloth for training in bandaging, firewood for instruction on evacuation in case of fire, vinegar for lectures on boiling water. In return, the guilds began to keep their own mini registers of outcomes. When fevers fell in the neighborhood with regular boiling and ventilation, and rose in the neighboring neighborhood with leaflets about shame, the dispute died down on its own. In the summer, fires ravaged the city, burns, soot, suffocation. The sections of the manuscripts were supplemented with brief but precise instructions. Do not open blisters, soften the skin with wine and vinegar compresses, apply even heat with a cloth, not fire, monitor breathing, and do not overheat. These pages passed without controversy. When a house is on fire, no one argues about courage. The men of the brotherhoods learned from the sisters to keep the corridors warm and quiet, and the language of care became common. The tone of previous accusations has softened. It is difficult to call luxury something that saves a blacksmith's hand or a singer's voice in the same way that it relieves pain in an adult woman. By autumn, they tried to regain their former leverage through accreditation of bodily words. The project required the coordination of any expressions of lower abdominal pain and spasms. The response was a public letter of care principles, posted on the gates and sent to the brotherhoods. The dignity of an adult patient, a minimum of cleanliness and warmth as a community duty, moderation against extremes, verifiability through accounting. It did not touch on dogma or matters of faith. It tied the hand at the basin to the rights of the person lying on the bench. To oppose such a letter meant to say no to boiling water and clean cloths. Politically, this seemed disadvantageous, and the project withered away. By this time, the texts and registers had begun to function as a silent network. Housewives stopped drying laundry in smoke. Laundries introduced shifts of heavy work for adult women. City doctors agreed on a winter threshold for bloodletting. At signs of exhaustion, refusal instead of incisions, warmth, water, food, sleep. Reports were sent to trustees with figures and words. How many cases of tremors were relieved by corridors of warmth? How many ulcers were covered with clean cloth? How many fainting spells disappeared after incisions were abolished? How much water was boiled and consumed? The myth of luxury care proved powerless in the face of survival accounting. This dry victory has a human cost that cannot be forgotten. Adult women slowly regained their sleep and strength. Caregivers hunched over from work. The scriptorium grew tired of ink and the fear of making a mistake with a word. But it was precisely this network of small decisions that held the fragile bridge between the charter and the infirmary. If tomorrow another letter about restraining the tongue appears, it will be met not with cries, but with a set of unchanging actions. Boiling water to the cell on time, clean cloth without wool, vinegar in small doses, corridors of warmth and silence, stamped lines without cuts, registration of outcomes in words. This is the document that survives any visitation, because it is signed not with the ink of authority, but with the relief of pain for those who get up from the bench and return to life. In the fall, when the fog from the river floodplains hung between the buildings and basements, strangers' hands closed over the infirmary again. But this time, the blow came not through words of courage, but through accusations of scientific debauchery. Several zealous clerics compiled a folder of clippings, carefully extracting from manuscripts formulas about warmth in the lower abdomen, about constriction and movement of juices in adult women, accompanied this with a list of stories without dates, and attributed that it was precisely such lines that encouraged debauchery. The paper looked convincing because it was devoid of dirt and everyday life. It did not contain the dampness of a cell, empty stomachs, rotten bandages, or emaciated bodies trembling from hunger and cold. The accusation hit their reputation and their wallets. Some of the trustees froze, putting aside jugs of vinegar and rolls of fabric until things were clarified. This was immediately felt in the cells. Boiling water began to arrive later for washing. The supply of clean fabric melted away faster than new cuts arrived, and the corridors of warmth began to malfunction. In the evenings, extra lines appeared in the register. The tremors lasted longer, sleep came later, and the smell of ulcers did not disappear on the third day, but on the fourth or fifth. Thus, the eloquence of paper became a direct factor of pain. The monastery responded not with indignation, but with the collection of evidence of neglect. A compact but dense package was sent to the trustees and the curia. On one side was a model list with stamps, where each dangerous line stood next to the procedure, measure, and sign of termination. On the other, a rolled-up register of outcomes for the last few months, where the words were numbers. How many washings? How many cases of bloodletting cancellation in emaciated adult women? On what day the tremors and smell went away? How many nights it took to breathe evenly? Attached to the package was a twisted ribbon of the herbal calendar and a list of natural expenses, firewood, vinegar, fabric, with a note indicating which surges required which supplies. It looked like a financial report, but it concealed ethics. Care is transparent, the outcome is verifiable, language is minimal, and accusations without practical support lose their weight. The city authorities, not wanting to drag out the scandal, offered a cross-check, a joint inspection of the cell and the garden with the participation of the city doctor. It was a painful visit because every minute had a price, but it was this visit that became the next turning point. The doctor, accustomed to professional pride, saw that in the cells they did not argue about words, but kept to the schedule and temperature by the book, that corridors of warmth was not an empty metaphor, but the route of jugs between the kitchen and the infirmary, that bandages were changed on schedule, not on inspiration. He also saw the flip side of the city's cleansing fashion. Adult women with gray faces, weak pulses, and icy hands after being cut open for hunger and cold. The report included words about the need for joint decisions on bloodletting in winter, in case of signs of exhaustion, refusal instead of incisions, warmth, vinegar rinses, moderate nutrition, and sleep. This document did not abolish the tradition. It introduced a threshold below which incision becomes a threat. The accusation weakened because it began to be compared not with commonplaces, but with a joint procedure. Meanwhile, another breakthrough had to be fixed: voluntary whitewashing in copies. Copyists from neighboring scriptoria, fearing visitation, erased sharp landmarks, the duration of compresses, signs of cancellation of warming, temperature clues. As a result, instead of a guide, they produced pious abstracts that were easy to misinterpret. The monastery responded with a double lock. In addition to the stamps in the margins, they introduced a parallel list of examples, where they painstakingly described a couple of illustrative cases for each vulnerable formula. If embarrassment and warmth were crossed out somewhere, then completely safe words about trembling, cold hands, rare pulse, and pain that went away after warming up and resting remained nearby. This list of examples became as important as the manuscript itself. It translated cautious terminology into the language of observation, which is more difficult to criticize. Copies ceased to shrink to emptiness, and with them, details ceased to die. Within the community, another type of wear and tear was growing: moral wear and tear. The sisters, who had been carrying boiling water and cloth for years, began to tire not only from the hard work, but also from the habit of everyone around them questioning every word of the text. In order not to collapse the system with the weight of mistrust, the board established rituals to support the caregivers: short prayer breaks without visits, gentle warming of hands after a long shift, scheduled changing of buckets, and a mandatory light lunch if the service was performed on foot without a break. In the records, this looked like an indirect but important result. There were fewer mistakes in measurements, fewer disruptions to the corridors of warmth and silence, and more stable care during the night. Caring for those who care turned out to be not a luxury, but a condition for the survival of patients. At the same time, a protracted debate was going on in the public square. Leaflets about shame as medicine were again being printed, but now they were met not with blind faith, but with a network of small practices. Housewives boiled water more often and dried laundry in the wind rather than in smoke. Laundries introduced lighter shifts for adult women after fevers. Brotherhoods brought vinegar to neighborhoods where it was damp and crowded. Merchant houses gave out fabric according to plan, not for the holiday, because they had learned to read the records of outcomes. The economy of care replaced the economy of fear. This was no miracle, but the result of tedious planning. Corridors, jugs, cloth, stamps, accounting. Little by little, the tone of external authority was also leveled. Diocesan officials, frightened by the scandal, received a set of impeccably formatted papers from the monastery, a neutral standard for medical records, where for each case the purpose, procedure, measure, cancellation threshold, expected outcome, and daily accounting were required. A list of terms permitted for copies, so that there would be no ambiguity anywhere. A clause on joint decision-making on bloodletting during the cold season. Such a package deprived the sensation of oxygen. In order to impose a ban for the sake of a ban, it was now necessary to press on what already seemed like common sense: boiling water, clean cloth, moderation, accounting. No one wanted to be the one who signed against these words. But even when the paper calmed down, the simplest truth remained in the cell, for the sake of which all this had been started. An adult woman, scarred by cuts and cold, stopped shivering on the third evening when she observed the corridor of warmth and ate moderate food. An ulcer, which had been covered with wool the day before, stopped smelling and pulling by the fifth day when washed with warm vinegar water and clean cloth. The dizziness of the woman who had been carrying the laundry for a week went away after a short nap and the removal of heavy work for an agreed period. These modest victories were written down evenly in the register and, when put together in lines, formed a wall through which the myth found it increasingly difficult to squeeze. At the end of the season, the board did something that cemented the change for years to come. It posted a public list of care principles at the gate and sent it out to the brotherhoods. There was not a single word in it that could spark a debate about morality. It contained 4 pillars, tested by the cell: the dignity of the adult patient, a minimum of cleanliness and warmth as a collective responsibility, moderation against extremes, verifiability through accounting and open registers. Next to it lay a model list with labels and a list of examples, so that anyone who wanted to could see how careful language was connected to action. Thus, the accusation of debauchery of science lost its stage. It had nothing to play with. What remained was a routine in which trashy words had no place. And yet, the story does not end with a fanfare. Dampness will return to the stone. Soot will settle on the beams again. Someone's hands will crack from vinegar and water again. But now, the cell has the tools to survive another season. A language that is invulnerable in form, which speaks only as much as is necessary for care. Registers where each measure is tied to the outcome. Agreements with the city that extinguish extremes. A network of small habits that are more valuable than loud gestures. This is the human choice that makes the finale possible. To resist the temptation to wave morality around where boiling water is needed, and not to let go of the fabric until the tremors subside. In this stubbornness lies a quiet victory over suspicion. By winter, when the stone began to give off cold from within, the infirmary was working like a well-oiled machine, and around it a network of habits had formed that no longer depended on anyone's goodwill. Housewives boiled water before putting jugs in the shade, laundresses changed heavy shifts for adult women after fevers, and brotherhoods kept a supply of vinegar and cloth according to the simple rule of seasonal surges. City doctors increasingly asked first about food, sleep, and warmth, and only then about herbs and incisions. The rhetoric about the luxury of care sounded like yesterday's news. Over the course of a year, it had lost touch with reality, where outcomes were not counted in words, but consisted of boiling water, clean cloth, and schedules. In the records, it looked dry. The tremors of the emaciated began to subside more quickly. The smell of ulcers lingered less often than expected. There were fewer fainting spells, and the return to light work took not weeks, but days, written out in full. But behind this dryness were human faces, and that is why the order survived another round of suspicion. The final blow came from where it was expected, but it still caused a stir. A code of conduct was drawn up on the protection of linguistic modesty, prescribing that any records of adult women's pain be transferred to closed archives. The package of papers looked decent, but in the cells it would mean a loss of memory. The monastery responded with the same tools that had helped them throughout the year. Standardized sheets were laid on the table. Purpose, procedure, measures, signs of termination, expected outcome, daily records. Next to them were sample lists with stamps and sheets of examples, where each cautious formula was tied to a case. At the request of the trustees, lists of natural supplies were attached: firewood, vinegar, cloth, grain, with notes on which weeks the consumption was particularly high. The third bundle contained a brief scroll of care principles already familiar to city brotherhoods: the dignity of an adult patient, a minimum of cleanliness, and warmth as a community duty, moderation against extremes, verifiability through accounting. This package turned out to be stronger than the plan. To request the closure of records, when a neat, neutral, and useful form was before their eyes meant to oppose boiling water and canvas. The document on chastity of language quietly disappeared in the office, and the standard remained, like a wooden beam on which both the monastery and the city now relied. Then the work began, not for the chronicles, but for memory. In the scriptorium, they compiled a short summary of care, not for beauty, but so that it could be held in wet hands. It included the lines that had survived all the visitations: warm water in small doses for those who were shivering, vinegar rinses for ulcers, refusal to perform incisions when adult women showed signs of exhaustion during the cold season, corridors of warmth and silence, relief from heavy work, daytime sleep for those exhausted from vigil and labor, ventilation without hypothermia, and a ban on woolen cloths on purulent surfaces. Opposite each point were words about the actual result and examples from the register. This compendium was copied for brotherhoods, parish houses, and households that had to keep their homes on the border between warmth and smoke in winter. Along with the compendium, principles were passed on to the people. Do not humiliate dignity. Do not confuse shame with treatment. Do not economize where economizing kills. There was also a shift in the city that rarely makes it into memoirs. Several trustees, tired of leaflets and gossip, declared that from now on, their donations would be made according to the rules of transparency, for jugs, canvas, firewood, and herb beds, without moralizing reservations. They asked only for open accounting and regular verbal reports on the results. This agreement was not a victory for one side. It was a mature deal where both sides understood what they were responsible for. For the cell, this meant predictability. The corridors of warmth no longer depended on whims. The supply of clean fabric no longer ran out because of other people's leaflets, and boiling water arrived at the right time. For the city, it meant clarity. How much was invested, how much was saved, where there were still gaps. Thus, the economics of care finally straightened out and ceased to be hostage to rhetoric. Of course, there were personal costs that did not fit into the tables. Caregivers continued to suffer from sore hands and backs, their eyes strained on the dimly lit steps of the cell, and some did not immediately regain sleep after winters of endless visits. The monastery kept them going with the same standard: mandatory short recovery periods, warm hand baths, shifts at the tub and at the table, a light lunch for those who stand on their feet all day. This is not piety, but the logistics of survival. When the holders of the system do not fall, neither do those on the benches. And it is here that it becomes clear why Hildegard's cautious language is not about courage, but about responsibility. It is not complex in its imagery, but in how closely it is tied to a bowl of boiling water and a clean cloth. Further on, the text ceased to be a reason and became a tool. Neighboring communities adopted not metaphors, but procedures. A sad but sensible arithmetic spread through the city. Fewer incisions in winter, when signs of exhaustion appeared, meant fewer fainting spells. More boiled water meant fewer fevers with a foul odor. More clean cloth meant more healed ulcers. More silence after washing meant fewer breakdowns. When asked what remained in the end, the answer was not heroic. What remained were manuscripts, cleansed of excess and reinforced with stamps. What remained was a standard of recording that reduces any passion to a goal, a procedure, a measure, signs of cessation, and accounting. There remained sets of outcomes that are sought not by politicians, but by those who place a bucket at the door of the cell at night. There remained principles that do not require faith, but require discipline, the dignity of an adult patient, a minimum of cleanliness and warmth, moderation, verifiability. Thus, the finale of this chronicle sounds quiet, like leveling breath. The myth that the Church forbade everything has not disappeared, but it has lost ground where the community has systematically organized care and protected the language sufficient for the task. The accusation of scientific debauchery did not drown in controversy, but dissolved in a procedure where each step is responsible for the outcome. The texts did not defeat anyone. They simply survived because they are signed with the heaviest argument: the relief of pain for those who came out of the infirmary into the light. And if, after some time, another paper again demands to pacify words, it will be answered not with a slogan, but with the usual sequence: boiling water, clean cloth, vinegar in small doses, corridors of warmth and silence, words recorded in the register. This will be the real result. The texts remain as a guide for care, because behind them are not only letters, but also the hands that held the bowls when conventional speech again tried to speak louder than human pain.